The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the judge's bench. My hands rested on the table in front of me. But they didn't feel like mine. They felt distant, like they belonged to someone watching this moment from far away. Across the room sat my husband, Eric Dawson, the man I had spent 8 years building a life with. Next to him was his lawyer, flipping through documents with calm confidence. A few rows behind them sat Alexis Monroe, the woman who had slowly stepped into my life pretending to be a friend. For months I had watched everything I believed about my marriage collapse piece by piece. First, the strange credit card statement. Then the missing money. Then the Instagram photo that revealed the truth I had been too afraid to say out loud. Eric had been preparing to leave me long before I even realized something was wrong. But today was different. My lawyer stood beside me and quietly closed his folder. Then he rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "before the court reaches any conclusions, we would like to call one additional witness." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Eric looked slightly confused. Alexis shifted in her chair. My heart began pounding in my chest, because I knew exactly who was about to walk through that door. And when the courtroom door finally opened, Eric's confident smile vanished instantly. "My name is Melissa Carter, and this is the story of how the man who thought he had planned the perfect divorce watched his entire strategy collapse in front of a courtroom. 8 years earlier, my life had looked completely different. I was 33 years old, working as an event manager in Charlotte, North Carolina. My job involved organizing corporate conferences, charity galas, and large professional gatherings. I lived in a world of schedules, contracts, seating charts, and careful planning. Every detail mattered, and I was good at keeping things organized. At home, I applied that same habit to my personal life. Our house ran on structure. Bills were paid on time. Vacations were scheduled months in advance. Social events were carefully coordinated so that Eric and I could maintain relationships with both friends and family. Eric Dawson, my husband, was 37 and worked as a project manager for a commercial construction company. He often talked about job sites, budgets, and building timelines. His work sounded complicated, and I trusted him to manage the financial side of things. Whenever money came up, Eric would smile confidently and say the same thing. "Don't worry about it. I've got the big stuff covered." And for years, I believed him. I handled our household schedules and everyday logistics. Eric handled the financial decisions related to his projects and investments. It seemed like a balanced partnership. At least that's what I thought. The first crack appeared on a quiet Tuesday evening early in the spring. I was standing in our kitchen sorting through a small stack of mail that had arrived that afternoon. Most of it was the usual collection of bills, advertisements, and bank notices. But one envelope caught my attention. It was a credit card statement addressed to Eric. That alone wasn't unusual. We had several financial accounts connected to our household. But when I opened the statement, I immediately noticed something strange. This wasn't one of our shared credit cards. The account number was completely unfamiliar. At first I assumed it might be a company card connected to Eric's job. But as I scanned the transactions, 3 specific charges made me pause. The first was for a diamond bracelet worth more than $1,500. The second was a one-night stay at a boutique hotel in Charleston. The third was a charge for fresh flowers costing nearly $80. I stared at the dates beside the purchases. They weren't connected to anything special. Not my birthday. Not our anniversary. Not Valentine's Day. Just a random Tuesday. I remember standing there in the kitchen for several minutes, holding that statement in my hands while trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a business gift. Maybe the hotel stay was related to work travel. Maybe the flowers had been sent to a client's family. Every explanation seemed possible. But something about the combination of those 3 purchases felt wrong. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. That evening, when Eric came home, I asked him about the statement while we were cleaning up after dinner. He didn't hesitate for even a second. The diamond bracelet, he explained, had been a gift for an important client. The hotel stay was connected to a construction meeting in Charleston, and the flowers were sent to the wife of a business partner who had recently helped finalize a deal. His explanation flowed smoothly, almost too smoothly. Eric spoke with the same confident tone he always used when discussing work, and for a moment, I felt embarrassed for even questioning him. But after Eric went upstairs later that night, I picked up the statement again. I looked at the charges one more time, and a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered something I didn't want to hear. Something wasn't right. Instead of throwing the statement away, I folded it carefully and placed it inside a small plastic container under the sink in our guest bathroom. At the time, I didn't know why I kept it. I only knew I didn't want it to disappear. Looking back now, I realized that moment was the beginning of everything, because that credit card statement became the first piece of evidence in a story that would eventually lead me into a courtroom, sitting across from the man who once promised we would build our future together. The next day, I tried to convince myself that the credit card statement meant nothing. Eric had given a reasonable explanation. People in business bought expensive gifts for clients all the time. Construction projects often required travel. Flowers could easily be a professional courtesy. Everything he said made sense. And yet the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I went to work that morning determined to focus on something else. My company was preparing a large corporate conference that would bring more than 400 guests to Charlotte. Coordinating vendors, managing seating plans, and scheduling presentations normally kept my mind busy enough to ignore personal worries. But throughout the day, the numbers from that statement kept replaying in my head. $1,500 for a bracelet. A boutique hotel in Charleston. Flowers sent on an ordinary Tuesday. By the afternoon, I felt almost foolish for thinking about it so much. Eric had never given me a reason to doubt him before. 8 years of marriage deserved more trust than a single piece of paper. Still, when I arrived home that evening, I found myself looking toward the bathroom cabinet where I had hidden the statement. I didn't take it out, but knowing it was there felt strangely important. A few days later, I mentioned the situation to someone I believed I could trust. Her name was Alexis Monroe. Alexis was 32 and worked as a real estate agent in Charlotte. I had met her a few times through social gatherings connected to Eric's professional circle. She was friendly, outgoing, and seemed to know a lot of people in the local business community. Whenever Eric and I attended networking events, Alexis was often there, moving comfortably through conversations with developers, investors, and contractors. She had always been kind to me, so when we met for coffee one afternoon after work, I casually brought up the credit card statement. "I probably sound ridiculous," I said, stirring my drink, but I found a credit card Eric never told me about. Alexis leaned forward slightly with interest. "What kind of charges?" she asked. I told her about the bracelet, the hotel in Charleston, and the flowers. Alexis listened carefully, nodding in a sympathetic way that made me feel understood. "Honestly," she said after a moment, "guys in construction deal with clients constantly. Expensive gifts aren't unusual." "That's what Eric said," I replied. "But if something feels off?" Alexis added gently, "You're not crazy for noticing it." Her tone was reassuring. At the time, I appreciated the support. What I didn't know was that the conversation we were having would not stay between us. The following evening, Eric came home in a completely different mood than usual. He walked into the kitchen while I was preparing dinner and dropped his keys on the counter with a sharp sound. His face looked tense. "What exactly have you been telling people about me?" he asked. The question caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" Eric crossed his arms. "I heard you've been asking around about my finances." For a moment, I couldn't understand what he was talking about. Then I realized, "You mean Alexis?" I asked. Eric didn't answer immediately. His silence confirmed everything. I felt my stomach tighten. "I just mentioned the credit card statement," I said. It wasn't a big conversation. Eric's expression hardened. "You're making me look like I'm hiding something," he said. "I wasn't accusing you of anything," I replied. "I just wanted a second opinion." "Well, maybe next time," he said sharply. "You should talk to me instead of spreading rumors." The word rumors stung more than I expected. I wasn't spreading rumors, I said quietly. But Eric was already shaking his head. You have no idea how things work in my industry, he continued. Clients. Gifts. Travel. It's part of the job. His voice carried a frustration I had rarely heard from him before. The conversation ended with both of us retreating to different parts of the house. Later that night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling in the dark. Eric had never reacted so strongly to something so small. And the strangest part wasn't his anger. It was the speed with which Alexis had apparently shared our private conversation. The next few weeks passed with a subtle but undeniable change in Eric's behavior. He began coming home later than usual. Sometimes he said he needed to meet clients for dinner. Other times he claimed a project required him to visit a job site after hours. I tried not to question him too much. But certain details began to stand out. His phone was almost always face down on the table now. When messages arrived, he checked them quickly and often stepped into another room. And whenever he returned home late, he went straight to the bathroom for a shower. At first I told myself he was just tired from work. But after noticing the pattern again and again, it started to feel different, almost as if he was trying to wash something away before speaking to me. One evening I watched him quietly from the kitchen doorway as he stood in the hallway typing a message on his phone. When he noticed me, he immediately locked the screen. Work stuff, he said quickly. I nodded. But the explanation felt incomplete. By the time summer arrived, the distance between us had become impossible to ignore. Eric still spoke politely. He still asked about my work and occasionally suggested we order dinner together. But something fundamental had changed. It was like living with someone who had already begun leaving, even though he was still standing in the same room. I kept thinking about that credit card statement hidden under the sink. The piece of paper I had almost thrown away. At the time, it seemed like a small detail. But deep down, I was beginning to suspect it was connected to something much larger. Something that had already started unfolding behind my back. And I was only just beginning to see the first signs of it. By the middle of summer, the tension inside our house had turned into something heavier than silence. Eric and I still lived under the same roof. But the rhythm of our life together had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. He stayed out later more often. Sometimes he said he was meeting investors. Other nights he claimed a project needed urgent attention at a job site outside the city. The explanations always sounded reasonable on the surface. But there was something rehearsed about them. Like lines from a script he had practiced many times before. I tried to focus on work instead of questioning him. My job as an event manager was entering its busiest season. And several large conferences were approaching. Long days at the office helped keep my thoughts occupied. But even during meetings, I found myself thinking about the small details that had started piling up. Eric's phone was almost never out of his sight anymore. If it buzzed, he checked it immediately. If he was sitting on the couch, the screen was always turned face down. And whenever he came home late, the same routine repeated itself. He walked in quietly, greeted me briefly, and went straight to the bathroom. The shower would start running within seconds. At first, I told myself he probably felt dirty after visiting construction sites. But after noticing the pattern over and over again, the behavior started to feel deliberate, like someone trying to erase something before being seen. One Sunday afternoon, I logged into our joint bank account to pay a few household bills. It was something I had done countless times before. But as I reviewed the recent transactions, one number immediately caught my attention. The balance was lower than I expected. Much lower. I scrolled through the transaction history slowly, double-checking each entry. Then I saw it. A transfer of $13,000. The money had been moved 3 days earlier from our joint account into another account I didn't recognize. I stared at the screen for several seconds, thinking I must have misunderstood something. Maybe it was connected to the mortgage. Maybe it was a scheduled investment. But the description next to the transfer didn't explain anything. It simply listed an account number I had never seen before. My heart started beating faster as I checked the rest of the account history. There were no large purchases, no major payments, nothing that could explain where that amount of money had gone. That evening, When Eric came home, I decided to ask him directly. We were sitting at the dining table finishing dinner when I brought it up. "Hey," I said casually. "I noticed a transfer from our account the other day. $13,000. Eric didn't look surprised. In fact, he barely paused before answering. "Oh, yeah," he said. "That's an investment I told you about." I frowned slightly. "What investment?" "One of the guys I work with is involved in a small development project," Eric explained. "Private deal. Good opportunity if it works out." He spoke confidently, leaning back in his chair as if discussing something routine. "The money's basically a short-term stake," he continued. "Should bring in a decent return." The explanation sounded polished. Too polished. "What kind of project?" I asked. "Mixed-use development," he replied quickly. "Retail and apartments. Early phase right now." I nodded slowly. The problem was that my job required constant attention to detail, and something about the way Eric described the project felt vague. Too many general terms. Too few specifics. But I didn't argue. Instead, I simply said, "Okay," and finished clearing the dishes. Later that night, after Eric had gone to bed, I opened my laptop and started searching. If Eric's project was legitimate, there would probably be some public information about it. Construction permits, business announcements, development news. Charlotte's real estate market was active enough that new projects rarely stayed completely hidden. I spent almost an hour looking through public records and industry articles, but nothing matched the description Eric had given me. No development proposal, no property listing connected to the company name he mentioned, no permits filed for a mixed-use building in the area he described. The absence of information made my stomach tighten. It didn't prove anything, but it made the situation feel stranger. Over the next few days, Eric's behavior continued following the same pattern. Late nights, private phone calls, quick showers the moment he walked through the door. One evening I watched him from the living room as he stood near the front window typing something quickly on his phone. When he noticed me looking at him, he slipped the phone into his pocket. "Just work stuff," he said. I nodded. But the answer felt automatic, like he had already decided that explanation would be enough. A week later, something happened that removed the last of my doubts. I was lying in bed scrolling through Instagram before falling asleep. It was something I rarely had time for, but that night my mind felt restless. As I moved through photos from friends and coworkers, one post stopped me instantly. It had been uploaded by one of Eric's cousins. The caption read, "Great Sunday BBQ with family." Curious. I opened the post. There were several pictures from the gathering. Children running across a backyard. Relatives standing near a grill. Groups of people smiling at the camera. I recognized most of the faces. They were members of Eric's family. But something immediately felt wrong. I hadn't been invited to this barbecue, and Eric had never mentioned it. My thumb moved slowly across the screen as I looked at the next photo. Then the next, and then the final one. In that picture, Eric stood near the grill with a relaxed smile on his face. Next to him was a woman wearing a light summer dress. She stood close enough that their shoulders touched. Her hand rested lightly against his arm. The two of them looked comfortable together. Familiar. Happy. I zoomed in on the photo, and the moment I recognized her face, the room seemed to tilt slightly around me. The woman standing beside my husband was Alexis Monroe. I stared at the photo for a long time before my mind fully accepted what I was seeing. Eric stood beside the grill in his cousin's backyard, wearing the same casual smile I remembered from family gatherings over the years. His arm rested loosely behind the chair Alexis was sitting in, his body angled slightly toward her. Alexis looked completely comfortable. She was wearing a white summer dress and holding a drink, laughing at something someone behind the camera had said. Her posture wasn't stiff or formal like someone attending a stranger's family event. She looked like she belonged there. That was the detail that made my chest tighten. I kept zooming in on the image as if it might somehow change if I looked closer. Eric's hand rested casually on the back of Alexis's chair. Alexis leaned slightly toward him, and several people in the background seemed to be smiling at both of them. It didn't look like the first time they had stood together like that. I lowered the phone slowly. The house around me was quiet. Eric was already asleep beside me, breathing evenly, completely unaware that the truth had just appeared on my screen. For several minutes I sat there in the dark, replaying the last few months in my mind. The credit card statement, the diamond bracelet, the hotel in Charleston, the flowers, the conversation with Alexis at the coffee shop, and the way Eric had come home angry the next day. Now everything began fitting together in a way that made my stomach twist. Because Alexis hadn't simply been someone I talked to about my suspicions. She had already been involved. The thought hit me with a strange kind of clarity. I had unknowingly confided in the very woman who was sleeping with my husband. I looked back at the Instagram post again. There were 6 photos from the barbecue. In 4 of them, Eric appeared somewhere in the background. In 3 of those 4 photos, Alexis stood nearby. I suddenly realized something even more disturbing. This wasn't just Eric bringing Alexis somewhere secretly. This was Eric bringing Alexis to a family gathering, which meant at least some of his relatives had already met her. And none of them had said a word to me. I locked my phone and set it on the nightstand. For a long time, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Eric slept beside me. The next morning I showed him the photo. He was standing in the kitchen pouring coffee when I slid my phone across the counter toward him. "What's this?" I asked quietly. Eric glanced down at the screen. For a brief moment, his face froze. It was a small reaction, almost invisible, but I saw it. Then he shrugged casually. "Oh," he said. "That barbecue? You didn't mention it," I replied. "It was last minute," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "My cousin invited a few people over. I kept my eyes on him, and Alexis was there." Eric didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said. "She works in real estate. My cousin's been asking her about some property deals." The explanation came quickly. Too quickly. I remembered the exact same tone he had used when explaining the credit card statement. Calm, confident, practiced. "So she's working with your family now?" I asked. Eric set the mug down. "Melissa," he said with a small sigh. "You're reading too much into this. I'm just asking questions. And I'm answering them," he replied. "It's business." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Eric picked up his keys. "I've got an early meeting," he said. "We'll talk later." He left the house a minute later. I stood in the kitchen listening to the sound of his car pulling away from the driveway. Something about the conversation stayed with me long after he left. It wasn't what Eric had said. It was how he had said it. He didn't look angry. He didn't look defensive. He looked prepared, as if he had already anticipated that question. Over the next few days, I noticed something else. Eric seemed almost relieved, like someone who believed he had successfully explained a situation and moved past it. But the opposite had happened. Seeing that photo had changed something inside me. Before that moment, I still had doubts. Now I had certainty. Eric and Alexis weren't just acquaintances. They were involved, and Eric had introduced her to his family. A week later, another shock arrived. I came home from work one afternoon carrying 2 folders filled with event schedules and vendor contracts. As I walked toward the front door, I noticed a large envelope wedged between the door and the frame. At first I assumed it was a package notice, but when I picked it up, the words printed on the front made my stomach drop. Legal documents. My hands suddenly felt cold. Inside the envelope were several neatly organized pages. The first line I read confirmed what I already feared. Eric Dawson had officially filed for divorce. I sat down at the kitchen table and began reading. The petition described our marriage in terms that felt completely unfamiliar. According to the document, Eric had been the primary financial provider throughout the relationship. The filing also stated that I had made minimal contribution to the accumulation of our shared assets. I read that sentence twice. 8 years of managing our household. 8 years of supporting Eric's career. And now the official legal record suggested I had barely participated in our life together. But that wasn't the worst part. As I continued reading, I noticed something even more troubling. Several financial accounts were listed with values that seemed far lower than what I remembered. Some investments were missing entirely, and the language describing Eric's financial holdings felt vague. I sat there for a long time staring at the paperwork spread across the table. For the first time, I realized something that made the entire situation feel even more dangerous. Eric hadn't just been cheating. He had been preparing for this divorce for a long time, and I had only just begun to see the plan unfolding. For the next several days, the divorce papers stayed exactly where I had left them on the kitchen table. I walked past them every morning before work and every evening when I came home, as if they were some kind of object I didn't fully recognize yet. Part of me kept hoping I had misunderstood something. But the documents were very clear. Eric had filed first, and the way the petition described our marriage made it sound as if I had barely existed in the financial life we built together. According to the paperwork, Eric had been the primary provider. His income, his investments, his business decisions, those were presented as the real foundation of our life. My role was described almost like a footnote. Minimal contribution. The phrase stayed in my head for days. I kept replaying the last 8 years in my mind, trying to understand how someone could erase so much history with a few sentences. I had organized every detail of our household. Paid bills, scheduled repairs, planned trips, managed calendars, supported Eric during stressful projects. But none of those things appeared in the legal story Eric had just told the court. A few nights later, I experienced another moment that removed any remaining illusions. I was driving home after meeting with a client about an upcoming charity event. The late afternoon traffic in Charlotte was slow, and I had taken a route through a busy shopping district. As I waited at a traffic light, something familiar caught my eye. Eric's car. It was parked along the street outside a small cafe. At first, I assumed he might be meeting someone for work. That wasn't unusual. But something made me glance toward the cafe window. Inside, Eric was sitting at a small table near the front. Across from him sat Alexis. They were leaning toward each other, speaking quietly. Eric said something that made Alexis laugh, and she reached across the table, briefly touching his arm. The gesture was small, but it carried an intimacy that no explanation could hide. I watched them for only a few seconds before the traffic light turned green. Then I drove away. The strange thing was that I didn't feel surprised anymore. The sight didn't even make my hands shake. It felt like confirmation of something I had already accepted. Eric and Alexis weren't trying to hide their relationship anymore. And in that moment, I realized something even more unsettling. Eric must have believed he had already secured his advantage. He had filed for divorce first. He had presented a financial narrative to the court, and he probably assumed I had no idea what he had been doing behind the scenes. For the next week, I felt as if I were moving through a fog. I still went to work. I still coordinated meetings and vendor calls. But every quiet moment brought the same question back to my mind. How long had Eric been preparing this? The credit card statement? The missing money? The sudden closeness between Eric and Alexis? None of it had happened suddenly. It had been building for months. Maybe longer? One evening I sat alone in the living room with a stack of financial documents spread across the coffee table. Bank statements, mortgage records, old tax forms. I had never paid close attention to these details before because I trusted Eric to manage them. Now I realized how dangerous that trust had been. Some of the numbers didn't look right. Certain investment values seemed lower than I remembered. And there were references to accounts that weren't explained clearly. The more I looked, the more confused I became. It felt like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. For the first time since the divorce papers arrived, fear began creeping in. What if Eric had already moved most of our money somewhere I couldn't see? What if the version of our finances presented to the court was the only version the judge would ever know? Late that night, I closed the laptop and sat quietly on the couch. The house felt strangely empty. Eric had started staying away more often, sometimes claiming he needed to spend nights near construction sites outside the city. Whether that was true or not didn't matter anymore. Our marriage was already ending. What mattered now was what would happen next. 2 days later, something unexpected occurred. My company was hosting a large corporate networking event downtown. Dozens of business leaders, consultants, and investors were attending. Events like this were my specialty. I moved through the ballroom coordinating staff, checking lighting arrangements, and confirming presentation schedules. For several hours, I managed to forget about my personal situation, until one particular guest approached the registration table. He was a man in his late 50s, sharply dressed, with the calm confidence of someone used to serious conversations. After checking in, he asked me a few questions about the evening's schedule. We spoke for a few minutes about the event logistics. Then he introduced himself. He was a family law attorney based in Charlotte. Something about that detail caught my attention. Maybe it was the exhaustion I had been carrying for weeks. Maybe it was the quiet desperation I hadn't admitted even to myself. But before I could stop myself, I heard my own voice asking a question. "Do you ever handle complicated financial divorces?" The attorney looked at me carefully. "Quite often," he replied. I hesitated for a moment, then said something I hadn't said to anyone yet. "I think my husband might be hiding money." The attorney didn't react with surprise. Instead, he simply nodded slightly. "Before you assume anything," he said calmly, "you should have someone review the numbers." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the night, because for the first time since the divorce papers appeared, the situation no longer felt completely hopeless. There might still be things Eric hadn't planned for, and if that was true, I needed to find them before the courtroom did. A few weeks after I first saw that photo, I still couldn't erase it from my mind. The image of Eric standing beside Alexis at his cousin's barbecue had settled somewhere deep inside me. Every time I tried to convince myself I might be overreacting, the memory of that photo came back with perfect clarity. Their shoulders touching, the relaxed smiles, the way everyone around them looked completely comfortable with the two of them standing together. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing another realization became. That gathering had been a family event, which meant Eric's relatives had already seen Alexis standing beside him. And none of them had told me. That thought stayed with me longer than the photo itself. For days I kept asking myself the same question. How long had this been happening? The answer finally appeared on an ordinary evening I hadn't expected to remember. It was late, and I was lying in bed scrolling through Instagram before going to sleep. Eric had fallen asleep beside me an hour earlier, breathing slowly, his phone resting on the nightstand. I almost didn't open the app at all. But when I did, the same photo from that barbecue appeared again near the top of my feed. This time I opened the post and looked through every picture more carefully. There were 6 images from the gathering. In the first photo, several family members stood around the grill. In the second, Eric's cousin held up a plate of food while people laughed in the background. The third showed a group sitting around a picnic table. Then I reached the 4th image. Eric stood there again. Alexis was next to him. This time I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. Someone in the background had their phone raised, as if taking another photo of the two of them. And several people nearby were smiling directly at Eric and Alexis. It wasn't the reaction people usually gave to strangers. It was the reaction people gave to a couple. A strange chill moved through my chest. I continued swiping. The 5th image showed Eric talking with his uncle. Alexis stood only a few feet away, chatting with Eric's aunt, as if they had known each other for years. Then I reached the last photo. Eric and Alexis again. This time they were sitting beside each other. Alexis leaned slightly toward him while laughing. Eric looked completely relaxed, comfortable, happy. The kind of happy expression I hadn't seen from him at home in months. I stared at the screen until the image began to blur. Then I locked my phone and placed it on the nightstand. For a long time I lay there staring at the ceiling. Everything I had suspected was now impossible to ignore. Eric hadn't just been seeing Alexis secretly. He had brought her into his family. He had allowed her to stand beside him in the place where I was supposed to be. The next morning I decided I couldn't pretend anymore. Eric was standing in the kitchen making coffee when I walked in. I didn't say anything at first. Instead, I placed my phone on the counter and slid it toward him. "What's this?" I asked. Eric glanced down. For a fraction of a second, his eyes widened. Then his face returned to the calm expression he always used when explaining things. "Oh," he said casually. "That barbecue? You didn't mention it." I replied, "It was last minute." Eric said, "My cousin invited a few people over." I kept watching him. And Alexis was there. Eric shrugged slightly. "She's helping my cousin look at some real estate investments," he said. They wanted her opinion. The explanation came quickly, almost automatically. I had heard that tone before. It was the same tone he used when explaining the credit card statement. Smooth, effortless, perfectly reasonable. Except it wasn't. "Eric," I said quietly, "why didn't you tell me about the barbecue?" He took a sip of coffee before answering. "Because it wasn't a big deal. That's your family. And it was just food and conversation." He looked at me then, his expression shifting slightly. "You're making this into something it isn't," he said. "Am I?" Eric set the mug down with a soft sound. "Melissa. Alexis works in real estate," he said patiently. "My cousin's been thinking about buying property outside the city. She's helping him evaluate it. So she just happened to be at a family barbecue." "Yes. And nobody thought it was strange that I wasn't there." Eric's expression tightened slightly. "You were busy," he said. "That's not the point." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You're overthinking this." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Eric picked up his keys. "I've got to get to work," he said. The conversation ended there. But the silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had said. Over the next few days, I noticed something else. Eric didn't bring up the conversation again. Not once. He behaved exactly the same as before. Late nights. Private phone calls. Showers the moment he walked through the door. It was as if he believed the explanation he had given was enough. But something inside me had already shifted. The trust that once filled our marriage had been replaced by something colder. Clarity. Because once you see the truth clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend you don't recognize it. And by that point, I knew something with absolute certainty. Eric wasn't just preparing to leave me. He had been building an entirely different life. And I had only just begun to see how carefully he had planned it. The envelope was still on the kitchen table when I woke up the next morning. For a few seconds I stared at it from across the room, hoping it might somehow disappear if I ignored it long enough. But the thick stack of legal documents sat exactly where I had left it the night before. Eric Dawson had officially filed for divorce. I made coffee and sat down at the table again, forcing myself to read through the paperwork a second time. The language was precise, formal, and strangely cold. Every sentence described our life together as if it were a simple business arrangement that had failed. The most painful part wasn't the divorce itself. It was the story Eric had told the court. According to the documents, Eric had been the primary financial contributor throughout the marriage. His income, his investments, his projects, all of them were described as the real foundation of our household. My role appeared small and almost insignificant. The filing stated that I had made minimal financial contribution to the marital estate. I stared at that phrase again. Minimal. For 8 years I had managed the house, organized our schedules, supported Eric through stressful projects, and handled the day-to-day responsibilities that allowed him to focus on work. But none of that existed inside this legal version of our marriage. The document made it sound as if Eric had built everything alone. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. Eric moved through the rooms like someone who had already left emotionally. He was polite but distant. We spoke about practical things, mail, groceries, schedules, but nothing deeper. Sometimes I wondered if he was relieved that the divorce papers were finally out in the open. At least now he no longer needed to hide the direction things were going. But one thing bothered me more than anything else. The financial numbers listed in the filing. Several accounts were valued far lower than what I remembered. Some investments were missing entirely, and certain transfers were described in ways that didn't explain where the money had actually gone. The more I looked at the paperwork, the more confused I became. One afternoon, about a week after receiving the documents, I experienced another moment that made everything feel painfully real. I had just finished meeting with a client downtown about an upcoming charity fundraiser. Traffic was slow as I drove back toward my office through one of Charlotte's busy shopping streets. Then I saw something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Eric's car. It was parked outside a small cafe near the corner. I might have driven past without thinking if the traffic hadn't slowed to a crawl. But as I rolled forward, I glanced through the cafe window. Inside, Eric was sitting at a small table. Across from him sat Alexis. They were leaning slightly toward each other, talking quietly. Alexis laughed at something Eric said and reached across the table, touching his arm. It wasn't the kind of gesture people made during business meetings. It was the kind of gesture people made when they were comfortable with each other. When the traffic light changed, I drove forward slowly. I didn't stop. I didn't confront them. I simply continued down the street. But something inside me settled into place during that drive. The situation was no longer confusing. Eric wasn't trying to hide his relationship with Alexis anymore, and the way he had filed the divorce suggested something even more troubling. He believed he had already secured his advantage. That realization stayed with me for the rest of the week. Late one evening, I sat alone in the living room with several financial documents spread across the coffee table. Bank statements, mortgage records, old tax returns. For years I had trusted Eric to handle the larger financial decisions. Now I realized how dangerous that trust had been. Certain numbers didn't look right. Some transfers didn't make sense. And the more I looked at the statements, the more I felt like I was staring at pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. The divorce filing suggested Eric had already arranged things in a way that favored him. What if he had been moving money somewhere I couldn't see? What if the version of our finances presented to the court was only part of the story? Those questions followed me everywhere. Then something unexpected happened. A few days later, my company hosted a large corporate networking event in downtown Charlotte. Events like this were routine for me. Hundreds of guests moved through the ballroom while I coordinated schedules, vendors, and presentations. For a few hours, I managed to focus completely on work. Then, near the registration desk, I met someone who would change the entire direction of my situation. He was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a dark suit, with the calm confidence of someone used to complicated conversations. After checking in, he asked me a few questions about the event schedule. We spoke briefly about the program and the evening's speakers. Then he introduced himself. He was a family law attorney based in Charlotte. Something about that detail caught my attention immediately. Maybe it was the exhaustion from weeks of stress. Maybe it was the quiet fear I had been carrying since the divorce papers arrived. But before I could stop myself, I heard my own voice asking a question. "Do you ever deal with complicated divorce cases?" The attorney looked at me carefully. "All the time," he said. I hesitated for a moment. Then I said the words I hadn't admitted to anyone yet. "I think my husband might be hiding money." The attorney didn't react with surprise. He simply nodded slowly. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the event ended. "Before you assume anything," he said calmly, "you should let someone review the numbers." That sentence echoed in my mind for the rest of the night. Because for the first time since the divorce began, a new possibility appeared. Maybe Eric's plan wasn't as perfect as he believed. And if that was true, I needed to discover it before the courtroom did. 3 days after the networking event, I walked into the law office with a cardboard storage box in my hands. The receptionist looked up as I stepped through the glass doors. The office was quiet and orderly, with shelves of legal books lining the walls and soft afternoon light coming through tall windows. "I have an appointment with Mr. Langford," I said. She nodded and gestured toward a chair. "Please have a seat. He'll be with you shortly." I placed the box on the floor beside me and sat down. My hands rested on top of it as if I were guarding something fragile. In a way, I was. Inside the box were months of small discoveries. Bank statements, credit card records, copies of emails, notes I had written late at night when certain details didn't make sense. For weeks I had been collecting them without knowing exactly what they meant. But today, Someone might finally be able to explain them. A few minutes later, a door opened down the hallway. The attorney I had met at the event stepped out and greeted me with a calm smile. "Melissa." "Come on in." His office was simple but comfortable, with a large wooden desk and several folders stacked neatly along one side. He noticed the box immediately. "That looks like a serious amount of paperwork," he said. I set the box on the desk. "It's everything I could find." He opened the lid and began lifting the folders one by one. At first, the room was quiet except for the sound of papers shifting. Then he stopped at a bank statement and looked at it more carefully. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It came with the mail about 4 months ago," I said. "It was addressed to Eric." "And you kept it?" "Yes." He nodded slightly and placed it beside him. Then he reached for another document. A credit card statement. The same one I had found that Tuesday night in the kitchen. His eyes moved slowly across the page. "Diamond bracelet," he murmured. My chest tightened slightly. "Yes." "And this hotel in Charleston." "I asked him about that," I said quietly. "He said it was a business trip." The attorney didn't respond immediately. Instead, he continued flipping through the papers. Occasionally, he circled something with a pen. Other times, he wrote a short note on a yellow legal pad beside him. After nearly 20 minutes, he leaned back in his chair. "Melissa," he said carefully, "how involved were you in your household finances?" I hesitated. "Not very," I admitted. "Eric handled most of the investments and larger transfers." "That's fairly common," he said. Then he tapped one of the statements with his pen. "But it also creates opportunities." "Opportunities for what?" He turned the paper toward me. "Moving money." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes, when someone anticipates a divorce," he said calmly, "they begin transferring assets out of marital accounts before the legal process begins." "Are you saying Eric did that?" "I'm saying the numbers here raise some questions." He slid 3 different statements across the desk. All of these transactions were labeled as project-related consulting payments, he explained. But they were sent to the same individual. I looked down at the name on the transfer line. Alexis Monroe. My throat felt dry. "That can't be right," I whispered. The attorney nodded slowly. "It's possible the payments were legitimate," he said. "But if that were true, there should be clear documentation showing the work she performed. And if there isn't, then it suggests something else." He opened another folder and showed me a series of transfers spanning more than a year. $5,000. Every month. Always sent to Alexis. "That's $60,000 in 12 months, he said quietly. "And that's just what we can see here." I stared at the documents in disbelief. Eric had told me Alexis was helping his cousin evaluate real estate investments. But these payments suggested something far larger. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. The attorney picked up another statement. "From the records you brought," he said slowly, "there are signs that more than $200,000 may have been transferred out of accounts connected to your marital assets." The number echoed in my mind. 200,000? For a moment I couldn't speak. All those years I had trusted Eric completely. And during that time he had been quietly moving money somewhere else. The attorney closed the folder and looked at me carefully. "Melissa, this doesn't prove wrongdoing yet," he said. "But it strongly suggests that your husband may have attempted to hide marital assets. What happens if that's true? In a divorce case, intentionally concealing assets can seriously damage a person's credibility in court." I leaned back in the chair, trying to process everything. Eric hadn't just been preparing for a divorce. He had been preparing to win it. By the time he filed those papers, he probably believed the financial picture was already arranged in his favor. "What do we do now?" I asked. The attorney folded his hands on the desk. "First, we continue gathering evidence." He pointed to the stack of documents. "You did something very important by saving these. I hadn't realized it at the time, but the small instinct that made me keep those papers might have changed everything. We'll request additional financial records," he continued. "Bank accounts, tax filings, corporate transfers. And Alexis, if she's receiving money under the label of consulting services, There should be contracts or invoices supporting that claim. And if there aren't, he gave a small, thoughtful nod, then the court will want to know why. As I prepared to leave the office that afternoon, the attorney handed me a folder with several notes written inside. "This process will take time," he said. "But if your husband has been hiding assets, the truth has a way of surfacing." I stepped outside into the warm Charlotte afternoon, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since Eric filed for divorce, I wasn't completely powerless. Because the story Eric had presented to the court was beginning to fall apart. And somewhere inside those financial records, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. 2 weeks after my first meeting with the attorney, the investigation began to reveal things I never expected to see. At first it started slowly. Requests for financial records were sent to several banks connected to our joint accounts. My attorney explained that this was a standard step in complicated divorce cases. When large sums of money were involved, both parties were required to disclose detailed financial information. But what surprised me was how quickly new details began appearing. One afternoon I sat in the attorney's office again while he reviewed a fresh stack of documents that had arrived from one of the banks. He flipped through the pages quietly, occasionally marking certain lines with a pen. Then he stopped. "This is interesting," he said. I leaned forward slightly. "What is it?" He turned one page toward me. "This transfer happened about 14 months ago," he said. "Look at the destination account." I followed the numbers across the statement until my eyes landed on the name connected to the receiving account. Monroe Consulting Services. My chest tightened immediately. "That's Alexis," I said quietly. "Yes?" the attorney replied. "But here's what makes this unusual." He pointed to another document. "This company appears to have been registered only a few weeks before the first payment arrived." I stared at the papers. "You mean she created the company just before Eric started paying her?" "That's what it looks like." The attorney turned several more pages. The payments were consistent. $5,000 each month, always labeled as consulting fees related to construction project planning. But something about the pattern didn't feel like legitimate business. "How many payments were there?" I asked. He scanned the document again. 14 so far, $70,000. And that was only one account. The attorney reached into another folder and removed a second set of statements. These came from a different bank. My stomach tightened again as he placed the pages on the desk. More transfers. More consulting fees. More references to Monroe Consulting Services. "How much total?" I asked quietly. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "From what we've confirmed so far, the transfers linked to Alexis alone exceed $90,000. The room suddenly felt very still. Eric hadn't just been sending her occasional money. He had been funding an entire financial arrangement. "And this doesn't include the company you mentioned earlier," the attorney added. "What company?" He slid another document across the desk. "A business registration. Dawson Project Holdings, LLC. "I've never heard of this," I said. "That's not unusual," he replied. "Sometimes individuals create separate entities to move funds in ways that appear legitimate on paper." The registration date caught my attention immediately. The company had been created less than a year before Eric filed for divorce. "What does it do?" I asked. "That's the interesting part," the attorney said. "There's no clear business activity attached to it." He flipped to the next page. But the company's bank account told a very different story. Large deposits had moved through it over several months. Then the funds had been redirected into other accounts. Some of those accounts led back to Alexis. Others appeared to lead somewhere else entirely. "How much money passed through this company?" I asked. The attorney tapped the page. "At least $130,000. The number left me speechless. Between the consulting payments and the company transfers, Eric had moved well over $200,000 away from our shared assets, all while preparing to claim in court that most of the marital finances belonged to him. "He planned this," I whispered. The attorney didn't disagree. "These transactions began long before the divorce filing," he said. "That suggests preparation." I sat quietly for several seconds. absorbing the reality of what Eric had done. For months he had told me that his late nights were work obligations, that the financial decisions he made were simply part of managing projects. But now the pattern looked very different. He had been building a financial escape route. And Alexis knew, I said. The attorney nodded slowly. If she created the consulting company and accepted these payments, she was involved in the structure. That thought made everything feel even more unsettling. Not only had Alexis been part of the affair, she had been part of the financial plan. What happens next? I asked. The attorney folded the documents together neatly. We continue documenting everything, he said. These records will become extremely important when the case reaches court. Can Eric deny it? He can try. But financial records are difficult to argue with. For the first time since the divorce began, I felt something shift inside me. Eric had believed he was controlling the entire situation. He had moved money quietly, filed for divorce first, presented a version of our finances that made me appear almost irrelevant. But the documents on that desk told a different story. A story of hidden transfers, fake consulting fees, and a company that existed for one purpose: moving marital money out of sight. As I gathered my things to leave, the attorney said something that stayed with me for the rest of the evening. If these records hold up, he said calmly, the court will take them very seriously. I stepped outside into the fading afternoon sunlight. For weeks I had felt like I was standing on the edge of losing everything. But now something had changed. The truth about Eric's plan was beginning to surface. And when that truth finally reached the courtroom, the story he had carefully built might collapse faster than he ever expected. 3 weeks before the court date, something happened that changed the direction of the entire case. I was sitting at my attorney's office again when his assistant knocked softly on the door. "There's someone here asking about the Dawson case," she said. My attorney looked up from the paperwork on his desk. "Did they give a name?" "Yes," she replied. "Rebecca Monroe." The name caught my attention immediately. Monroe, the same last name as Alexis. My attorney glanced toward me before turning back to his assistant. "Send her in." A few moments later, the door opened, and a young woman stepped inside. She looked nervous, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't completely sure she should be there. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and a simple sweater that made her look more like a college student than someone involved in a legal case. "Hi," she said quietly. "I'm Rebecca." My attorney gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." Rebecca sat down slowly, glancing briefly at me before looking back at him. "I hope it's okay that I came here," she said. "That depends," my attorney replied calmly. "What would you like to talk about?" Rebecca hesitated for a moment. Then she took a slow breath. "It's about Eric Dawson and my cousin Alexis." My chest tightened. "You're related to Alexis?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "She's my older cousin." For a moment the room was silent. Then Rebecca continued. "I heard about the divorce from my aunt," she said carefully. "And I recognized Eric's name." My attorney leaned forward slightly. "What made you decide to come here?" Rebecca looked down at her hands. Because something about the situation didn't feel right. She reached into her bag and removed a small folder. "I think you should see these." My attorney accepted the folder and began reviewing the papers inside. At first his expression remained neutral. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. "Where did these come from?" he asked. Rebecca looked uncomfortable. "A few months ago there was a family dinner at my aunt's house," she explained. "Alexis had been drinking a little, and she started talking about her new consulting work." My stomach tightened as she continued. She said she had a client who was paying her $5,000 a month for consulting advice. The amount matched the transfers we had already discovered. "But the way she talked about it," Rebecca continued quietly, "she made it sound like the payments weren't really for work." My attorney placed the documents on the desk. "What exactly did she say?" Rebecca took another breath before answering. "She said the man she was seeing was getting ready to leave his wife." My chest felt suddenly heavy. "And before filing for divorce, he wanted to move some money where his wife couldn't reach it." My attorney exchanged a brief glance with me. Did she mention Eric by name? He asked. Rebecca nodded slowly. Yes. The room fell completely silent. Then Rebecca reached back into her bag. There's more. She pulled out several printed pages and placed them on the desk. Emails. Bank notifications. Screenshots of text messages. These were on Alexis's laptop, she said quietly. You had access to her laptop? My attorney asked. Not exactly, Rebecca admitted. But one night she asked me to help her print some documents. And I saw the email thread open on the screen. My attorney began reading through the pages. As he did, the room grew quieter with each passing moment. Finally, he looked up. These emails discussed transferring money through the consulting company, he said. Rebecca nodded. And they mentioned preparing everything before the divorce filing. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Eric hadn't just been moving money secretly. He had been discussing the plan openly with Alexis. There's another message, Rebecca said. She pointed to one of the printed pages. It's from Eric. My attorney read it silently for a moment. Then he spoke the words aloud. Once the divorce filing happens, the numbers will already be adjusted. The meaning was unmistakable. Eric had expected the financial situation to appear smaller by the time the court reviewed it. My attorney closed the folder slowly. Rebecca, he said carefully, why did you decide to bring this to us? She hesitated before answering. Because I know what Alexis did was wrong. And Eric, he knew exactly what he was doing. Her voice was steady now. I don't want to be part of something like that. My attorney nodded thoughtfully. Would you be willing to testify about this in court? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. For a few seconds she stared down at the documents spread across the desk. Then she looked up. Yes, she said quietly. If it helps tell the truth. A long silence followed. Because in that moment, the entire case had changed. Before Rebecca walked into the office, we had financial records and suspicious transfers. Now we had something even stronger. A witness who could explain exactly how the plan had been created. My attorney gathered the documents carefully and placed them back inside the folder. These will need to be verified, he said. But if everything here is accurate, this testimony could be extremely important. Rebecca nodded. I understand. As she stood to leave, she glanced briefly in my direction. I'm sorry for everything that happened, she said quietly. I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. After she left the office, my attorney leaned back in his chair. Well, he said slowly, that was unexpected. Is it enough? I asked. He gave a small, thoughtful smile. Let's just say, he replied, your husband's situation just became significantly more complicated. For the first time since the divorce began, I allowed myself to believe something I hadn't dared to consider before. Eric's plan might not survive the courtroom. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. I had imagined something louder, more chaotic, voices arguing, papers shuffling, tension filling every corner of the room. Instead, the atmosphere felt strangely controlled, almost calm. But underneath that calm, everything felt sharp. Every word, every glance, every movement. Eric was already seated at the table across the aisle when I entered with my attorney. He wore a dark suit that looked carefully chosen for the occasion. The same kind of confident professionalism he had used in countless business meetings. Alexis sat several rows behind him. She was dressed in a pale summer dress, her posture straight, her expression composed. From a distance, she almost looked relaxed, as if she were attending a formal event rather than a court hearing. For a moment, Eric glanced toward me. Our eyes met briefly. There was no anger in his expression. No regret either. Just the same calm certainty he had carried throughout the entire divorce process. The certainty of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. My attorney placed a folder on the table and leaned slightly toward me. Just breathe, he said quietly. I nodded. Across the room, Eric's lawyer stood and began presenting their case. His voice was smooth and confident as he described Eric's career, his financial contributions, and the structure of our marital assets. Listening to him felt surreal. He spoke about our marriage as if it were a simple financial arrangement that had ended naturally. Eric, he argued, had been the primary provider. The investments belonged largely to him. The transfers connected to Alexis were described as legitimate consulting payments for professional services. At several points, he even suggested that Eric had been unusually generous throughout the relationship. I sat quietly while he spoke. My attorney occasionally made notes, his pen moving steadily across a legal pad. Then it was our turn. When my attorney stood, the entire tone of the room shifted slightly. He began calmly, reviewing the timeline of the marriage and the financial records connected to our accounts. At first, the discussion focused on numbers, bank statements, transfer records, corporate registrations. The documents we had gathered over the past several weeks were displayed clearly for the court. One by one, the monthly consulting payments to Alexis appeared on the screen. $5,000. Again and again, month after month. Eric remained still as the records were presented, but Alexis shifted slightly in her seat behind him. Then my attorney introduced the second part of the evidence. Dawson Project Holdings LLC, the shell company. The additional transfers that moved more than $100,000 through accounts connected to Eric. The judge listened carefully, occasionally asking brief questions about specific dates or transactions. Eric's lawyer attempted to explain the payments as part of legitimate business activity, but the explanations sounded less confident than they had earlier. Still, nothing in the courtroom had fully changed the balance of the case. Not yet. Then my attorney closed one folder and looked toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "we would like to call an additional witness." Eric's attorney frowned slightly. "Who?" he asked. My attorney turned toward the courtroom door. "Rebecca Monroe." The name seemed to echo softly in the quiet room. I glanced across the aisle. For the first time that day, Eric's expression changed. His shoulders stiffened slightly. Behind him, Alexis turned toward the door. And then the door opened. Rebecca stepped inside. She looked smaller in the large courtroom than she had in the attorney's office, but there was a quiet determination in her expression. The bailiff directed her toward the witness stand. As she walked past Eric's table, Alexis's face lost its confident composure. The color drained from her expression. Eric stared at Rebecca with an intensity I had never seen before. For a moment it looked as if he were trying to process what was happening. Rebecca raised her hand and took the oath. Then she sat down. My attorney approached the stand. "Miss Monroe," he said calmly, "how are you related to Alexis Monroe?" "She's my cousin," Rebecca replied. "And have you had conversations with Alexis about Eric Dawson?" "Yes." The courtroom remained completely silent. Rebecca spoke clearly, her voice steady as she described the dinner at her aunt's house. She explained how Alexis had talked about the consulting arrangement, how she had described receiving $5,000 every month, and how she had laughed about the way the payments were structured. "So his wife won't see the real numbers," Alexis had said. The words hung in the air like a weight. Eric's lawyer objected once, briefly, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. Rebecca then described the emails she had seen on Alexis's laptop, the messages between Alexis and Eric discussing the consulting payments, the references to adjusting financial records before the divorce filing. My attorney displayed several of the emails on the screen. The courtroom grew even quieter as the messages appeared. One line stood out clearly. "Once the divorce filing happens, the numbers will already be adjusted." Eric sat completely still, but Alexis looked down at her hands. When Rebecca finished her testimony, the silence in the courtroom felt almost overwhelming. For the first time that day, Eric no longer looked confident. He looked uncertain, and Alexis looked terrified. The careful plan they had built over months had just been exposed in front of the court, and the hearing wasn't even over yet. The courtroom remained silent for several long moments after Rebecca finished speaking. No one moved. The judge studied the documents on the desk while the attorneys waited. Even the faint sounds of shuffling papers had stopped. The stillness felt heavy, like the entire room was holding its breath. Across the aisle, Eric looked very different from the confident man who had walked into the courtroom earlier that morning. His posture was rigid now, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Behind him, Alexis sat perfectly still. The calm smile she had worn when the hearing began was gone. My attorney returned to his seat beside me and quietly closed the folder containing the evidence. Then the judge began speaking. His voice was steady, measured, the tone of someone who had seen many complicated cases before. But there was something unmistakably firm in the way he addressed the court. He reviewed the financial records first. The consulting payments, the company accounts, the transfers that had moved large sums of money out of the marital assets before the divorce filing. He spoke carefully about the responsibilities both spouses hold when presenting financial disclosures during a divorce. Then he addressed Rebecca's testimony. The emails, the messages, the description of the plan that had been discussed before the divorce was filed. For several seconds, the judge said nothing more. Then he delivered the decision. Based on the financial evidence presented, the court determined that the marital assets had not been accurately disclosed during the divorce filing. The transfers made to Monroe Consulting Services and through Dawson Project Holdings, LLC, would be reviewed as potential attempts to conceal marital funds. Until the review was completed, those accounts would be frozen. The courtroom remained silent. Then the judge continued. Given the pattern of transfers and the testimony presented, the court ruled that the majority of the marital assets, including the house, would remain under my control until the investigation concluded. My breath caught in my chest. For weeks, I had been preparing myself for the possibility of losing everything. The house, my financial stability, the life I had built during 8 years of marriage. But in that moment, the direction of the entire case had changed. The judge closed the file and looked toward both attorneys. Additional financial review will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities, he said. The meaning was clear. The situation Eric had created was no longer just a divorce dispute. It was now a financial investigation. Eric's lawyer stood quickly, whispering something to him. Eric didn't respond. He remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the table in front of him as if the outcome still hadn't fully reached him. Then he stood and walked toward the exit without looking back. Alexis followed a few seconds later. She moved quickly, avoiding everyone's eyes as she left the courtroom. When the door closed behind them, the tension in the room seemed to dissolve all at once. My attorney turned toward me with a quiet nod. That went about as well as it could have, he said. I exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, the constant weight of uncertainty began to lift from my chest. But what surprised me most was not the legal victory. It was the feeling that came afterward. Relief. Not because I had won something, but because the truth had finally been heard. A few minutes later, I stepped out into the courthouse hallway. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, filling the corridor with warm light. People passed by in quiet conversations, their footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. At the far end of the hallway, I noticed someone standing near the wall. Rebecca. She looked almost unsure whether she should still be there. When she saw me walking toward her, she straightened slightly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she gave a small nod. I'm glad I came forward, she said quietly. So am I replied. There were 100 things I could have said in that moment. Thank you. You changed everything. You didn't have to do that. But somehow none of those words felt necessary. Because sometimes the most powerful choices people make are the ones they make quietly. Rebecca gave another small nod before turning toward the exit. Within a few seconds, she disappeared down the hallway. I stood there for a moment longer, watching the light fall across the courthouse floor. 8 years of my life had ended inside that courtroom. But something new had begun as well. Not a perfect ending. Not an easy one. Just the simple truth that justice sometimes arrives from the most unexpected places. And that even when betrayal feels overwhelming, the truth has a way of finding its way into the light. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever faced betrayal, or watched someone try to twist the truth for their own advantage, then stay with this channel. Stories like this remind us that the truth matters, And sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that change everything. If you want to hear more real stories about justice, resilience, and the unexpected twists life can bring, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Because sometimes the most powerful conversations begin after the story ends. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.